Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm Knut Dethlefsen and I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And thank you very much for joining us for our live stream event, The Path to Victory, the 2024 US presidential election, and where we will discuss not only the presidential election, but also how polls look like going into Super Tuesday and the rest of the election year. And of course, we do want to talk about Democratic strategy up and down the ballot. In 9 months, on November 5th, American voters will decide who the new or old occupant of the White House will be. A decision that will have global and domestic consequences. And people in Europe are particularly worried about the election. There are a number of critical issues at play in the election: inflation and the economy, reproductive rights, and the access to abortion. And right now, in particular, immigration and the border, to just name a few. And that is to say nothing of the two candidates who are both unpopular with the American electorate for different reasons. Super Tuesday, which will take place next week on March 5th, should give some hints on what to expect in November's general elections. 15 states and 1 territory, including North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, will hold their primaries on that day. Though the Democratic and Republican nominees for president are virtually decided at this point, with the Biden-Trump rematch practically guaranteed, their performances on Super Tuesday and the demographic of voters who do or don't show up will tell us what challenges each candidate might face. And I'm really excited to introduce 2 guests who will discuss all these questions with me and, in a way, with you. First of all, thank you very much for being with us today and for sharing your insights and your time with us. And first, I would like to introduce Molly Murphy. She's a top pollster and campaign strategist who has worked on some of the most consequential campaigns in recent history. She has worked with hundreds of state, congressional, and local races all over the country, helping elect Democrats in Republican and swing districts and in competitive primaries. She also serves as a lead advisor to the DCCC and supports the DSCC and DGA in electing Democrats across the country. In 2020, Molly was part of North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's successful re-election campaign after helping him in 2016 win. That means winning twice in a state that Trump won on the top of the ticket in 2018. Molly helped Kyrsten Sinema navigate a tight race and to become the first woman elected to the US Senate from Arizona. She has overseen numerous of victories at the congressional level as well. And I'm also very excited to introduce Jacob Rubashkin, Deputy Editor of Inside Elections, which provides nonpartisan analysis of campaigns for Senate, House, Governor, and President. He's co-host of the Inside Elections podcast and a contributor to the election site 538. Jacob has appeared on CNN, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, the BBC, Scripps News, among others, and has been quoted on elections in major outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. On election night in 2020, Jacob worked on the decision desk at Edison Research, which provides results to ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN. Jacob, we would like to start with you. So what do you think in the 2024 election cycle will matter, and how do you think this cycle will be remembered?
Well, this cycle will be remembered as one of the few rematches in American presidential politics. You have to go all the way back to 1956 to find a rematch when Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson faced off for the second time. You've got to go all the way back to the 1800s to find a time when a former president was nominated by a major party to take back his position with the Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison election. So we are looking at a really unprecedented race, and I think ultimately that is how the history books will remember this contest within the context of American politics. I think what's driving this race, though, is you've got two very baked in but unpopular nominees from each party. Americans know Joe Biden, they know Donald Trump, and they know how they feel about both of those men. And broadly speaking, neither of them are popular. Donald Trump has never been popular among the American public. And for the last several years, Joe Biden has not been popular either. And so you've got two unpopular candidates, neither of whom most Americans would probably pick if they had their pick of anyone in the world to be president, but who, because of the party system and because of their strengths within their parties, are the nominees going up against each other. And what that means is that a lot of voters are going to have to make a very difficult decision between two candidates that they don't really agree with on all of the issues or on whether they should be president or not. So there's going to be a portion of American voters, I call them the double haters, that don't like Trump and don't like Biden, and those people will determine the results of the election. And it will come down to, in my mind, whether the qualms that voters have with the current president, Biden, either about his age or about the economic situation, outweigh the very serious concerns they have about Donald Trump, both in terms of the chaos that we saw pervade a lot of his administration in 2020 and before, and also how he handled the loss of the 2020 election to Biden, his attempt to overthrow the election, and continued inability to accept those results. So a lot of voters are going to be making a difficult decision between two choices that they don't particularly like either one of them, and that's what this race is going to come down to.
All right. So, Molly, do you agree that Joe Biden is an unpopular candidate? And do you think, how should Democrats then approach the 2024 election, and maybe not only looking at the president, but also to the bottom of the ballot?
Sure. I mean, it's unquestionably true that Joe Biden is unpopular. He has been for a couple of years into his presidency. I think Jacob made the important point that Donald Trump has never been popular. Voters have never liked him. And it's more complicated when it comes to voters' relationships with Joe Biden. They tend to like him, the person. They tend to think that he genuinely cares and that he's got compassion for people, that he understands the challenges people are facing in their lives. And a lot of their frustration with him is more their frustration about how things feel in this country right now. And it's natural for people to take that out on who the president is and who is in leadership. And so to answer your second question about how Democrats should be approaching this election cycle is, I would say, two things. One is the economy is undoubtedly driving a lot of voters' concerns and anxieties right now. They personally are still struggling with high cost of groceries, high cost of housing. And while the macroeconomic circumstances in the United States are quite strong, low unemployment, strong stock market, inflation down compared to other parts of the world, for the average person who's trying to make ends meet, they're still struggling. And that's what's really dominating when they don't feel good about the economy. That is what is driving those perceptions. Now, that doesn't have a partisan sort of fix to it. Voters don't necessarily know, how do we fix these things? Democrats have offered ideas, Republicans have offered ideas. I think Democrats need to continue to push for how their policies are addressing those concerns voters are feeling. But then I also think the important thing is not to allow this to purely become an election that is litigated on the economy. And I think it does have to be widened out to be more about issues like abortion and women's reproductive issues, one where Democrats have a decisive advantage over Republicans, and one that we saw in the 22 midterms was incredibly persuasive to voters. The other issue is with Trump at the top of the ticket, raising real questions not just about whether he's going to abide by the election results, whether he's going to try to seek, to overturn them, but the day-to-day chaos that Trump brings that voters do, have started to fade in their memories, but when they are reminded of them are deeply troubling to them. And so driving those contrasts and making sure this election doesn't really just become you're frustrated with your life, vote for change, but instead is a bigger conversation, I think is the most important thing for Democrats to do.
May I just ask a more general question? Obviously we are focused on the election, and we have kind of the longest campaign in modern history in the US. Are people already focused on the election? Are the voters already focused on the election? Or is the election in the US still far away?
I think more and more people are getting more and more focused on it as every single day, which is perhaps a weak answer, but I think it's the truth. We are in the earliest general election matchup for all intents and purposes in certainly as long as I can remember. And think back to, we know who the nominees are going to be in both parties in February, and that is incredibly rare in American presidential politics. So I do think there's an element of voters being conditioned to not really pay attention to the presidential race until a month, 2 months from now. Not necessarily all the way to the convention, perhaps, but I do think there's an element of disengagement that we're starting to see shift toward engagement with the election. But for the most part, I think that voters have a lot going on in their lives, right? We tend to forget this sitting here in DC, but people have jobs, people have families, people have 10,000 other concerns that come before the November 5th election in their minds. And so that will change as we get closer, but at the moment I think there's still a large share of voters who are only tangentially thinking about the race.
Yeah, I don't think the voters who will determine the outcome of this election are not yet paying attention to the election. I think that there are a lot of voters who know who they're voting for. If you are a hardcore Joe Biden voter, you probably are pretty political, you probably care a great deal, and it feels like the election is around the corner. And the same can be said for those who are supporting Trump. They want this election to come. They want to go out and support Donald Trump. And then those voters in the middle, the double haters, certainly those who don't really like either candidate, wish they had different choices, voters who don't care about politics, who are completely disinterested in it. They vote because of a civic duty, but they don't necessarily think about this. They don't follow news. They're not, tracking who's going to be the nominee, that Super Tuesday is even upon us. Those voters are going to engage later. And I think that, elections in the US, because they don't end, that we really go from one election to the next, and the coverage and the, following really doesn't ever take a pause. I think it goes in sort of waves. And I think right now we are in the referendum period of this election, where people aren't thinking Biden versus Trump. They're thinking, I'm unhappy with Biden, I'm unhappy with Trump. I'm just going to sit in those feelings right now, and I've got a long time to decide. At the end of the day, can one of them win me back? Can I, sort of see a dimension of one of these candidates that's going to make up my mind? And so even for those voters who are paying attention, they're not thinking about the either or just yet. They're not making a choice.
Yeah, and now a lot of people say that the election, you talked who will decide the election. There are people who know, but there is a number of people, voters, who will decide the election. Last election was super tight. A few key swing states and maybe even key counties decided the election. And is that true also in this election, or do we overlook something if we just remember how it was 4 years ago?
It's generally true. So, I think that ultimately right now you could say that this election will be decided by a combination of 6 states, ultimately. And those states are what we call the blue wall, which are Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. They're Midwestern states. historically have been more democratic. That's why we call them the blue wall, large working class population, union laborers, historic democratic coalition. That has changed over time as the democratic coalition has shifted a little bit. Still, Democrats have done better there over the past several cycles than Republicans, but those margins have gotten closer and closer. So those three, I would say, are most likely to be predictive of the outcome, with then Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia being states that are also likely to, and flipped in 2020. Joe Biden won all 6 of those states, but are looking maybe a little bit more competitive. Now, if Joe Biden loses some of those states, he can still win. If Donald Trump loses some of those states, he can still win. It doesn't mean that whoever wins has to run the table, but ultimately, sort of rough math would be that whoever is able to win at least 3 of those states will win the presidency. Now, that doesn't mean that you should ignore other states that are seeing some changing trends. Moving towards Democrats over time, a state like Texas, they're changing demographics, it's become more and more competitive. That's one you certainly want to pay attention to. And a state like Minnesota, which is also in the Midwest, was very close in 2016, perhaps could be close again. So there are certainly states on a watch list, so to speak, to see whether there are going to be disruptions in past elections. You never want to only abide by what happened 4 years ago, but it is pretty safe to assume that the states that determine the outcomes in 16 and 20 will still be the states that determine the outcomes this time around.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Molly said, and I think especially when you're looking at a presidential election that is a rematch, right? It's not past presidential performance is always one of the best predictors of how a constituency is going to vote in the next election, and that's true not just at the state level, but at the congressional district level. But certainly when you're talking about the exact same 2 candidates, obviously circumstances have changed, but again, voters know both of these 2 candidates. They're not being introduced to them for the first time. So absolutely, those 6 states will be the core of the presidential battlefield. But again, the states have the capacity to surprise. I think about, a race like the 2008 election, for instance, which is a blowout by modern American standards. Obama won by over 7 points against John McCain, and you had all sorts of interesting, quirky results. Obama won Indiana, which is a very traditionally Republican state. He came very close in Missouri, in Montana, and South Dakota. You can end up with these kind of interesting blips on the radar screen that can, have an effect on the election. So I think certainly a state like Texas is absolutely worth watching. Biden has shown some stronger resilience, perhaps, in those blue wall states and in some of the other Midwestern states than he has in the Sun Belt states. And so, I think that ultimately we're looking at a fairly circumscribed battlefield, but I might also include North Carolina in there. I think that these elections are so it's so important to win, right? Obviously, everybody wants to win, but there's so much resource and energy being put toward looking for paths to victory that it's not unreasonable to expect that both campaigns will look not just at those core 6 states, but elsewhere where they can try and pick up additional electoral votes. Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, for instance, is one of the few places where you can win an individual district and pick up votes. There's going to be a lot of focus there on Omaha, Nebraska, of all places. Maine's 2nd congressional district, which is a vast rural region at the very northern reach of the Northeast, is another one of those places. And in a close election, the campaigns are going to be focused not just on winning the big prizes, but stealing a few votes where they can elsewhere, in the case, in the possibility that it could be decided by 1 or 2 electoral votes, because that has happened in recent memory in American political elections.
And what are the voters that will decide the elections? Is it the undecided voters, the non-voters? And where are they voters geographically and demographically? And what issues do matter to these voters? And are they different for Democrats and Republicans? Maybe you would like to start, Jake.
Yeah, look, I think that there are undecided voters everywhere, right? I think we forget that sometimes, but there's flex in the electorate no matter where you look. There are undecided voters in Utah and in Iowa and in Idaho and in Vermont and New York as well, right? It's just that there are a couple of states where those undecided voters sit right in the middle, in that kind of 45 to 55 region that makes them so crucial at winning elections. I think when you look at those 6 states that Molly mentioned, you've got kind of 2 broad categories of voters that are perhaps ships in the night when it comes to their political affiliation. You have a traditional Democratic coalition of blue-collar workers, of labor unions, traditionally people without college degrees, who voted very strongly for Democrats for decades, went strong for Obama, and then broke toward Donald Trump. And there is some indication that some of those voters are more willing to vote for Joe Biden, perhaps, than they were Hillary Clinton. But by and large, those voters have left the Democratic Party. They are crucial voting blocs for Republicans in those Midwestern states, in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. At the same time, you've got suburban voters in the suburbs outside of Pittsburgh and Detroit and Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and also in those Sun Belt states, in the ring suburbs around Atlanta, in Georgia, that historically have voted for Republicans, were very big fans of Mitt Romney, of John McCain, and can't stand Trump. And so those populations are growing. The blue-collar, non-college educated voters are decreasing in number and in proportion of the electorate. And it's a question of, for Democrats, can they continue to build on their margins with those suburban voters while holding their margins of loss down among the non-college educated working class voters, particularly white working class voters. And for Republicans, it's kind of the flip side of the equation. Can you claw back some of those voters in the Atlanta suburbs, for instance, while also driving up your numbers in the more rural areas?
I agree with all of that. I would also add that I think that going into 2024, part of Democrats' winning coalition was driving turnout with younger people who tend to vote Democratic when they vote, but are less reliable voters than older voters who always vote. They tend to fall in and out of the electorate in their youth. They're reflecting fairly low engagement right now. They showed up, they delivered big results for Democrats in the 22 midterm elections, but right now they're saying, I'm not that enthusiastic about voting. So I think one of the determinants of the outcomes of this election will be whether young people engage as we get closer, whether they show up to vote and vote for Democrats when they do. And I think the same can be said for different communities of color. So African American voters, especially in places like the Philadelphia area, the Detroit area, and then Hispanic voters in places like Arizona and Nevada, where they make up sizable populations, they have been moving a little bit away from Democrats. They still are, by and large, more of a Democratic constituency than Republican, but that's a group that has become a little bit more swing. But the other piece is they're a little bit less engaged. They say they're not as excited about the election. And so in addition to persuading those, sort of swing voters who, when they vote, sometimes vote Democratic and sometimes vote Republican, I think Democrats are also going to have to try to push some of their base to show up and find ways to motivate them.
And now, do you think that voter fatigue will be a problem in the election, or will we have like high turnout again like we had 4 years ago? I mean, like when we look at 2016, a lot of the now Trump has been out of office for quite a while, but in 2016, a lot of people supported him because they were first-time voters, or they were people who don't believe in the system. And in 2020, it was the other way around. I mean, maybe Joe Biden won because a lot of voters showed up to rebuke Trump, to push back against Trump. And that was also important, I think, 2018 and also even in the 2022 cycle that played a role. And will that continue to be an important driver? I mean, what will drive really voters to show up, or will there be this voter fatigue?
I don't think that there will be voter fatigue, and I think today there is. I think right now, we are very much in that referendum period where voters are just sort of saying, I'm not too happy with Joe Biden and I'm really not happy with Donald Trump. And that's where they are. And they think they have time to say, okay, it's a pill to swallow. You've got to sort of decide. You've got to look a little closer at the candidates. As Jacob said earlier, these candidates are incredibly well defined at this point. I would say historically so. You don't typically have candidates who everyone has made up their mind about and has had impressions of for years in the way that we do in this election. And so as we get closer, I think we'll have a better understanding of whether the fatigue and malaise that voters are feeling right now about a rematch is going to hold, or if we've got so much time that they just say, I'm going to engage later, I'll get there, I'm not going to not show up, I still don't like Trump. The reasons I didn't like Trump and voted against him initially are the same reasons I can't support him now. So I think in some ways it's a little too early to predict that, but we're definitely seeing signs that some of those voters who were so motivated to vote against Trump are less enthusiastic. But I think, again, to your broader question about how to engage these voters, one thing we saw in non-presidential elections over the past several years is there's a lot of energy to show up to vote against what voters believe to be not just Trump's extremism, but the bleed of that extremism to the entire Republican Party. In 2022, people were forecasting that would be an incredibly good cycle for Republicans, historic trends. You have voters who vote against the president's party, but because of things like, the Supreme Court overturning abortion protections and many, many candidates saying, I'm not even going to abide by these election results, those things became motivators that were separate of just whether or not you liked the candidates and were far more indicative of what voters did not want this country to turn into.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think we're still far enough out from the election that there's plenty of time for voters to re-engage, even though right now clearly there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the choices they have. I do think I would caution against using 2020 as a benchmark, perhaps. I think that election was so unprecedented in all of its facets, not just because of who Donald Trump was, but because of the circumstances within the COVID-19 pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd. You had an immense amount of social unrest that was engaging people of all stripes in the politics, but you also had a massive expansion of voting opportunity because of the pandemic. A lot of states went out of their way to make voting the most accessible that it's been in recent memory, certainly. And so you were able to introduce a lot more voters into the electorate in ways that have since been cut back, right? I think part of that was a natural, as COVID faded as a concern for Americans, states undid the emergency measures that they had put in place to allow for more straightforward voting, but also because of what Trump was saying about mail-in ballots, about early voting, about the ways that states were making it easier for people to vote, because Trump pointed to those methods, falsely, of course, as evidence of fraud, as opportunities for fraud. We have seen Republican states especially kind of turn the clock back and limit opportunities to vote within their states. And so I do think that we're going to see a natural kind of tightening of the electorate. I would be surprised if we saw turnout as high in 2024 as we did in 2020, just because that year was so unique. But I do think ultimately one thing we know about Trump is that he motivates voters. And every time he's been on the ballot since 2016, every time he's been president, every time since he's become president, he has brought his people out, but he's also brought out his opponents. And I see no reason to believe why that won't be the case in 2024.
And let's talk about Trump for a minute. Trump has been, has a lot of legal troubles for good reasons. So do the indictments matter in the election process? Will they be decisive for the vote in November? And can Democrats use that in any way?
I think so. But I think that there's going to be nuance. I think that one thing that is remarkable about Trump is that opinions of Trump dictate how people look at his indictments. The indictments don't predict how people view Trump, which is to say, if you like Trump, you think these indictments are unfair, they're a persecution, they're overblown, or they're politically motivated. And so if you like Trump, hearing about these indictments does not make you like him less, because you are so motivated by your feelings towards him. And the same is true on the other side. If you don't like Trump, these indictments are good reinforcement for all of the reasons that you didn't like him and you haven't liked him. So in those ways, it's not, I don't think, going to be the most effective tool to change the way people think about him. They're very much reinforcing of either the love people have for him or the disdain they have for him. But I do think that the nature of the chaos, the nature of the unpredictability of how these things may end, the idea that he may be served a prison sentence, things that go beyond what people have ever had to consider in a presidential nominee, those are the things that I do think have the opportunity to really raise the stakes for this election and ask voters, is Trump worth it, especially when most don't like him to begin with. Now, the second piece I would say about it is I think there are pieces where the indictments allow you to reopen conversations that voters may have otherwise closed the book on. They don't want to look back to 2020. They don't typically look back 4 years when they make up their minds about who to vote for. That's just, voters are really focused on the immediate and the present. But things like these indictments, I do think, allow Democrats to have a conversation about the idea that Trump has always felt he was above the law, that the rules do not apply to him, and that will continue in a second term. And that raises the stakes. He's unrepentant in these legal proceedings. And so anytime he says and doubles down on the fact that he did nothing wrong or that he's not going to change his course, arguably has become even more emboldened to do worse. I think that allows for more opportunities for Democrats to say, look, this wasn't a one-time thing. This is an unrepentant man. This person has always felt he was above the law and will continue to be. And I think that those are the opportunities Democrats can seize on, as opposed to just sort of elevating his past crimes, which I think a lot of people have kind of decided on one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that one of Trump's biggest liabilities is his inability to let go of 2020. Molly's right, the voters don't like to look back 4 years when making a decision, but Trump does, right? Trump clearly believes, wrongly, but clearly believes that he won. He's convinced himself that he won in 2020, and he will tell anyone who asks him about that that is the case. And that rubs voters the wrong way, because voters don't want someone who is looking back. Voters want someone who is looking forward. And we see this not just among Democrats, but look, Nikki Haley, to the extent that she's still running for president, one of her big lines against Trump is that he's too focused on the past, right? That this run is in a lot of ways all about clearing up what happened in 2020. He's running to avenge the election that was stolen from him. More practically, you might argue he's running to avoid prosecution for his actions in the wake of that election. But I think the fact that he is so centered on the 2020 election and what he believes was this grave injustice done to him is a liability for him, because voters believe that he lost the election. Voters don't like what happened on January 6th, even if they don't really like to think about it. And the more that it's in the news and the more that Trump is confronted with that news on a daily basis, and believe me, he will be asked about it on an ongoing basis from now until Election Day. And he will never say the things that he needs to say in order to assuage voters that he's not stuck in the past. But the other point I would make is that I think that there are a lot of practical and even logistical implications of being on trial and being under such legal scrutiny that a presidential candidate has never had to face before. I mean, Trump is dealing with this right now. He's got this $450 million judgment in the civil case in New York that's hanging over his head. He's got to come up with that money, right? He's going to have to take loans out on his buildings, if not sell them outright to raise that cash. He doesn't have the cash there. His political committees have already spent upwards of $70 million on his legal fees. If you're a major Republican donor and you're looking at a candidate who is incurring hundreds of millions of dollars in legal costs and judgments, you're going to think twice about cutting him a big check, because you don't know whether that money is going to go to him getting elected or if it's going to go to the state of New York or to E. Jean Carroll or to one of the other places where he's got to put money to make his legal problems go away. And so it's going to be more difficult for him to raise money, more difficult for him to stay on message. And if he actually does go on trial in one of the several cases against him, more difficult for him to campaign. So there are logistical, practical implications separate and apart from the political impact of these indictments that I think are going to have a real effect on his race.
And does it help or hurt Trump that he has been out of the mainstream spotlight for the last 3 years?
It helps him. Easiest question you could ask me.
Okay.
It helps him. Yeah, I mean, voters do not like hearing from Trump. The first thing they will tell you is, I wish he would stop tweeting. You know, the idea that every day when he was president and when he was campaigning before that in the 2016 elections, every day that they turned on the news and had to hear another, you know, sort of Trump poking and, you know, bullying someone, being, you know, rude, being ignorant, all of those things were major detractors for him and contributed to why people wanted him out. When he is distracted, when he is in court, when he is not, you know, on Twitter and not getting the same type of wall-to-wall coverage, those memories fade. And so it does absolutely help him. Now, I think the question is, it is impossible in presidential elections that are billion-dollar campaigns for a candidate to be invisible. They can be invisible in the off year, you know, in 2023 for people. His rallies, you know, his audience watches that, but very few other voters are watching those things. So we know he's out there, but for the average voter, they're not seeing it all the time. And I do think that shifts. I don't think it's possible to win an election without being very much in the public eye. And so he is going to have to change that. And to Jacob's point, he's not on message. You know, he's not said, you know, I'm going to tighten up. I'm going to make this, you know, a referendum on the economy and Joe Biden's leadership. He is pursuing old wounds. He is, you know, fighting old battles. And voters are tired of that. But right now, they're not hearing it. And that is incredibly helpful to him.
But will they hear it?
I think so, yes. I think that as it becomes, as we shift into general election mode, you know, I think as the Republican primary wraps up, as voters begin to pay more attention, and as the media kind of stops, you know, thinking about him as a Republican running for president and starts thinking of him as the Republican nominee for president, there will be a natural increase in scrutiny. You know, certainly as he does general election events. Obviously, when we get to the convention, if we have debates, there are going to be a lot of opportunities for him to be a lot more public over the next 8 months. I think it's going to be very difficult for him, especially given his. It's not as if he is hiding, right? I think that he will want to be out there as well, for better or for worse. And so I think voters are going to hear a lot more from him. And I think the Biden campaign is going to make every effort to put his words in front of more voters in every kind of medium they can, whether that's trying to get reporters to cover it or spending money to put it in campaign ads that they're going to be running for the next 8 months. I think that there's a vested interest in re-exposing Americans to Donald Trump and kind of everything about him, not just the perhaps fuzzy memories that voters have developed over the last 3 years of the Biden administration.
So Democrats will use Trump as a
Absolutely.
motivator?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So this just like one more maybe like question like about like Trump is and also where it's going for him. It's like Nikki Haley staying in the race. She's most likely not going to win the nomination, but does that hurt Trump? Does it help Biden? Does it matter?
I probably, given those three options, probably narrowly fall in that it doesn't matter. But I do think that it is more of a thorn in Trump's side, and I think anyone out there, especially someone who is a Republican, a respected Republican, driving an attack against Trump is good for Biden and for Democrats. Do I think that she is going to persuade the sort of, swing voters, the undecided voters in some of these key states by what she's saying right now and in the primary? Maybe not, but I think that it's always helpful when voters are hearing not just from the usual suspects criticizing the opposition party. So people expect a Democrat not to like Trump. They expect Biden to say Trump is a bad fit, he shouldn't be the president. But when you hear it from a Republican, I think it does potentially give more people pause. I do just think that this contest, she has peaked, is my hunch. A state like New Hampshire is a very good state for her. She did well. Her home state, South Carolina, she won 40%. She's ultimately going to sort of peter out from there. Her money is drying up, and I think we're so far from when voters are going to make up their minds that I think it's not going to be a top-of-mind consideration.
I think it probably, on balance, if you fast forward to November, it's not really... The difference is not going to be made on whether Nikki Haley drops out today or dropped out a month ago or stays in to the convention. But I do think that because especially the voters that she's appealing to within the Republican Party, right? She is appealing to a lot of the voters with a similar profile to the swing voters that Biden is going to want to bring into his coalition. If you look at where she has done the best in the Republican primary, it is cities and especially suburbs, the places that have the highest education. In South Carolina, her home state, she won 3 counties. Those were the 3 counties with the highest college education rates of the entire state. And so I think for those voters, most of them, the vast majority, are going to vote for Trump, right? The vast majority of Nikki Haley's supporters are going to vote for Trump. But if there are even a few of them who are have now gotten into the mindset almost of not voting for Trump, right? They have broken with him in a strong enough way that they voted for someone else in the primary. I think that's a sign that there's opportunity for Biden among maybe not those voters specifically, but voters who look like them, who think like them, who have voted Republican in the past, but clearly are unhappy with Trump 8 years into of his role on the national stage. So I don't think ultimately it matters all that much whether Nikki Haley stays in for another week or another month, but I do think that she gives Democrats something to look forward to, and obviously is getting under Trump's skin in a really major way by sticking around.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about issues too, and I mean the economy and the bad vibes, the bad mood. I mean, honestly speaking, I don't really understand the bad mood because the economy is going relatively well, and particularly if you compare, and I mean, Biden has a lot of successes. So how can you turn that around? How can you push back against the bad vibes? Or otherwise, probably that's going to be a real problem.
Yeah, I think you can do one of 2 things with bad vibes. And probably Biden and Democrats have to do both. I think the first is don't tell people they're wrong. I think the last thing people want when they themselves are struggling to pay their bills. They are struggling to afford housing. These things are real. These are not imagined for people. And when you are struggling with those things, it's a little less consequential to you how well the stock market is doing or where unemployment is. If your job doesn't pay enough, the idea that unemployment is low, that doesn't necessarily help you at the end of the day. So I think when Democrats talk about the economy, they can embrace the progress and they can embrace the strengths. It doesn't mean cede that ground and say, yeah, everything's awful, I agree with your vibes. But still acknowledge that even when some things are going well, that doesn't mean at the individual level people are doing well. And I think recognizing that and being willing to take that on and speak to those concerns is a huge start for people. And I think the second piece is, don't take the blame, don't take the bait that the bad vibes are your fault. A lot of the reason for the bad vibes right now are also the idea that people's rights are going away and that people are too politically divisive and that, women in Alabama can no longer seek IVF services, right? Things are getting worse and worse in ways that are not tied just to the economy. It's a whole lot of, what feels like a very uncertain future, especially for young people. And Republicans own a lot of that. And so I think the other piece that, Democrats are going to have to contend with is not just trying to change the vibes, but make other people responsible for some of those bad vibes, specifically Republicans.
But can they also offer something? I mean, at the end of the day, for me, politics is also, you want to change, you want to change something in a certain direction. I would hope that for the Democrats, they want to make the lives of working families better.
Absolutely.
And can they offer something
I
credible
think so.
that they will do that they offer really a better future?
I think absolutely. I think that a lot of what Democrats have done to navigate this difficult economy and what Biden inherited when he got there all speaks to that and speaks to the idea that he has focused on the right things, that he's thinking about people, he's offering that vision. My point is less to not offer that, but instead to recognize that just because there's been progress in some of those places doesn't mean everybody's feeling it yet. And offer that's why I'm continuing to push on these things. That's why my vision is to do this. That is why I'm going to continue to reduce, drug prices. That's why I'm going to continue to address high energy costs. Things like that do speak to the concerns people are feeling. And certainly on the protections, protecting access to abortion, passing laws that guarantee that a woman has access to abortion. Those sorts of things are absolutely things people need to hear.
I think inflation is a particularly pernicious economic problem to confront because the solution in most voters' minds, just make things less expensive again, is by and large not how the economy works. Once prices go up, except in gasoline and a few kind of grocery items, prices don't come back down. You can slow the rise, but we know that it's kind of a one-directional ratchet when it comes to prices. So there's not much Biden can do to just make everything less expensive or as expensive as it was back in 2020, and that's a difficult hurdle. I think that the fact that we're now several years into both the period of high inflation and a cooling off period, voters' baseline is going to shift from the old kind of thinking about how much things cost to the new thinking. There's research to suggest that voters operate on kind of a 2-year delay when it comes to prices. So, last year they were thinking about how much things cost in 2021, but by the end of this year, they're going to be thinking about how much things cost at the end of 2022, which is better for Democrats. I think that on the perhaps not on the presidential side as much, but certainly on the down ballot side, we've seen Democrats really lean into the money that was passed out of Congress in 2021 and 2022. And this is not, it was a huge sum of money overall, but for any individual congressman being able to go home and carry out a big check for $20 million or $10 million for a local project, that's a really big deal. And that can help you counteract the messaging that DC isn't doing enough for your own community if you're actually bringing back dollars. I think that we have seen a bit of a shift. I think we've seen consumer sentiment begin to rebound, and I think we've seen a commensurate shift in Republican messaging, right? If you'll notice, and I don't have empirical data to back this up, but it's something that I've seen anecdotally, Republicans talk a lot more about the border and immigration than they do about the economy these days. I think a year ago, it was economy, inflation, 100% of the time, and that is no longer the case. I think that there has been a refocus on the Republican side toward the border, toward immigration, as the new kind of issue to use as a weapon against the Democrats and Biden. And I think that's a reflection, yes, of the situation at the border, but also of the improving situation in the economy and an understanding that that might not be as salient for voters by election day because we are seeing the economy continue to improve. So I think all of that is important. And then, I think Molly's point about abortion and reproductive access is absolutely crucial. And to your question about what are Democrats offering, abortion is this odd issue where Democrats are in power in D.C., right? They control the White House, they controlled Congress for 2 years. Now it's split. But when it comes to reproductive rights, Republicans are the incumbent party because they control the courts, right? So the Supreme Court, which has a Republican majority, a conservative majority, overturned Roe versus Wade. Right, that happened when Democrats were in power, in full control of Washington, as we like to say, and yet it was the Republicans and the conservatives who enacted one of the biggest policy shifts of the last generation. And so Democrats almost have the opportunity to run against the incumbent Republican judicial power on the issue of abortion and make the change argument for themselves. We're going to change the status quo to restore reproductive rights. And I think that's a compelling message.
So will it be a driver reproductive rights in the abortion for Democrats? I mean, you conducted a poll that showed, I think, that birth control was a particular effective motivator for less enthusiastic group in the Democratic coalition.
That's right.
And is that so? Is that going to be a big deal in the
There's
election?
all the evidence to suggest that. That obviously was absolutely and empirically true in 2022. That was, there were a number of reasons I think that Democrats did well beyond expectations for that cycle, but I think the first and chief among that was that voters were incredibly motivated to vote against Republicans on their abortion bans, but also just to stop electing Republicans who would enact more of them. And I think that issue has not gone down in voters' minds. I think the question always is, after an election, did voters get it out of their systems? Did they vote on abortion, and so they're not going to vote on that again? They feel like they've kind of expressed their sentiment on it. But as more states, as these Republican legislatures and Republican-led states in particular continue to pass restrictions on abortion and going deeper into birth control, as my recent poll found, Alabama certainly IVF, the ramifications are deeper than abortion. And that's what I think voters are realizing now. I think in 2022, it was squarely and singularly about abortion. And now that, Roe has been overturned and there has been more time for these, various Republican policy outfits to push their anti-birth control, anti-IVF, anti-abortion agendas, voters are realizing that there are deeper ramifications and they're incredibly concerned about it. So there is all the evidence in the world that it will be a driver. One thing that I think is always true in elections is that voters don't find issues on their own. The parties, the candidates have to serve them up to people. And so I do think it is incumbent upon the candidates running to make this forefront in their campaigns.
We have 10 more minutes left, so we need to really focus, because we need to talk briefly about foreign policy. Foreign policy, why? Obviously, there is the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza does probably not help Joe Biden. Is foreign policy in this election gonna be important for Joe Biden and his re-election? And is it potentially gonna harm his re-election prospects?
Yeah, I think that yes and no. Overall, American voters tend not to care very much about foreign policy. It ranks very low on the issues when you ask voters what the most important issue that determines their choice. Foreign policy ranks below the economy, below healthcare, protecting democracy, abortion access, gun control, climate change. There are a lot of other things American voters tend to think about first. You've really got to go back all the way to 2006 to find a national election that was largely about foreign policy, and the Iraq War in that case. And 2008 was about to be a foreign policy election until the economic collapse. But since then, we haven't seen foreign policy be the dominant through line in a race. However, for Joe Biden, because young voters are such a crucial part of the Democratic coalition, and because young voters, by and large, are the ones who have the most concerns, particularly about the war in Gaza, I think that it is a problem for him when it comes to enthusiasm. He has got to convince enough young voters to show up. It's not as if they're going to vote for Donald Trump necessarily, but young voters are already the least likely to show up to the polls, and now they've got this issue that they really don't appreciate the president's position on, it just makes it that much more difficult to encourage the level of turnout that he'll need in order to be successful. And the issue there is that there are young voters everywhere, right? Young voters can make the difference no matter kind of what state or polity you're looking at. And so I think it's a challenge for him. I think it's not an insurmountable one, but in that particular demographic, it's going to be something the campaign has to address.
Like in Michigan, in the primary, 100,000
About 100,000 voted uncommitted.
voted uncommitted. That was 13%. And that could be like in Michigan, 2020. How many voters? 20,000, 30,000 made the difference. So that's why people like maybe Tuesday was a bad day, bad omen for Joe Biden.
Yeah, I take the Tuesday results with a little bit of a grain of salt in being a predictive measure of the general election for a very similar reason, motivated by different things, than I take, where Nikki Haley is in this election.
Okay.
Because voters who show up in primaries are not general election swing voters for the most part. Now, that isn't always the case. There are certainly people who are voting in the primary because they dislike Donald Trump and they are very much a swing voter. There are certainly voters who showed up in the Democratic primary because they weren't happy with Joe Biden and wanted to send that message. But I do think that for the most part, those who are participating are Democrats, or they are voters who are already not going to vote for Joe Biden and enjoyed the opportunity to show up to send a message that they're unhappy with him. And so I take it with more of a grain of salt than anything. If anything, I would say you could make the counter argument. I look at Tuesday as more of a Rorschach test.
Okay.
You can see what you want to see.
Yeah, and now just super briefly, now even big topic, probably immigration, the border is I think probably a really big problem for the US, apart from the election. But now for the election, is it going to harm Democrats, the situation at the border? Is it a liability, and what can they do about it? Should they be hard on immigration, close the border, follow or can they have a different, more productive approach towards immigration and try to fix the system?
I think that Republicans are betting big that the border will be a decisive issue against Democrats in the election. So it absolutely could be. Historically, Democrats are, trusted far less than Republicans are on the issue of the border. I think the difference in this election and in this moment is that Republicans tried to play a game of chicken. They bet big on this border deal. They tied it to Ukraine funding. They said we must get this done. And Democrats said, let's play ball. And they actually did work on a fairly popular, toothy piece of border policy, and Republicans were the ones that walked away. I think that does create an opening for Democrats to actually drive some of the conversation. I would also say, just to answer the question briefly, I think one of the reasons Democrats have historically lagged on immigration is they don't talk about it very much. And when you don't talk about something very much, voters assume you don't care about it. So I actually think Democrats could do far better on this issue by just simply engaging in it, identifying it as a problem and an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that will get them pretty far.
Yeah, I think setting aside kind of the question, the substantive questions of the situation at the border, from a political perspective, the outcome of the negotiations on the border bill, and then the Republican backing down from a bill that Jim Lankford, the senator from Oklahoma who negotiated that bill, is a conservative's conservative. He is not a moderate Republican by any definition. And I think that the political impact of that whole fiasco is probably the best outcome for Democrats, in that they look like they get to say that they put out a border bill that gave Republicans a lot of what they were looking for, did not give Democrats a lot of what they were looking for in terms of immigration reform, that they really made a good faith effort to pass a bill that Republicans said that they wanted. And because Donald Trump decided that publicly that he thought this bill would help Democrats, he killed it among House Republicans. And for Democrats, that's not in dispute, right? Republicans were very open about the fact that this bill went down because Trump and his allies believed that if it passed, it would be good for the situation at the border and therefore good for Biden. And that was unacceptable. And that kind of political gamesmanship, I think, is something that voters reject, right, on any issue, but especially one that they care about. And so Democrats are able to say, look, we tried. We made a good faith effort. Republicans killed it, not for good reasons, but for political reasons. So whenever Republicans go after Democrats for immigration from now on, that's going to be the response, which I think is a more compelling response that Democrats have had in the past couple election cycles.
So you basically get now like 30, 40 seconds for like wrapping it up. So what should Democrats be focusing on?
I think Democrats need to focus on their strength, which is caring about people. People believe Democrats care more than Republicans. Show the ways you care about people, not just on sort of the cost pains that they're feeling, but also wanting to guarantee future rights, future opportunities, address the bad vibes. That's what I think Democrats should do.
Any polling trend we are missing that's very important?
Look, I think that as voters begin to come to terms with the fact that this is an election between Trump and Biden, which I think we're going to begin to see after Super Tuesday, certainly when Nikki Haley drops out of the race. I want to see how Biden's number rebounds, especially among soft Democrats, independents, Democratic leaners who are unhappy with him but also don't like Trump. And the other thing I'm interested in is kind of does Trump's number move? Because what we've seen is that Trump has kind of a ceiling in a lot of polls, and that even the polls where he's ahead of Biden by a lot, he's still in that kind of 47%, 48% range. He got about 47% in 2016. He got 48% in 2020. That was enough to win. The lower number was enough to win in 2016. The higher number was not enough to win in 2020. Clearly, a majority of Americans are not going to vote for Donald Trump. It's just a question of can Biden kind of reclaim the people that he's lost over the last couple of years once they begin to see this race as a binary choice.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you so much, Molly, for sharing your insights, your expertise, and your enthusiasm with us about the election. We are certainly very enthusiastic that you tuned in to our event today, The Path to Victory, the 2024 US election. We have covered a lot of ground, and we talked about swim stakes, we talked about the direction of the election, the candidates' soft spots, and how they can, how Democrats can build maybe a more effective narrative. And I hope you, thank you for tuning in, enjoyed the conversation, and perhaps even learned something new along the way. And thank you for joining us. And make sure that you follow the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung's DC office on all its platforms. We are usually at FES_DC, and there you will find lots of interesting content about American politics, and of course, particularly interesting in this election year. I think personally that this election is very important for the American democracy and probably for democracy in the Western world in general. And I think that's why it's important that we continue discussing it. And with that, thank you again. And I'm signing off from Washington, D.C.